Thank you very much, Professor Novak. And now it's a great honor to bring to the podium for his presentation on Catholicism and Distributism, Mr. Thomas Storck, a member of the editorial board of Seton Hall University's The Chesterton Review and one of the leaders in the Society for Distributism. Mr. Storck.
Thank you very much. I suspect it's merely an accident of the alphabet that I'm the last speaker, but it gives me a certain advantage because I get to hear what the others have said. And I'll be representing today, as you know, distributism, which is probably not as well known to you. Certainly capitalism is well known to you, or ought to be. And we tend to talk a lot about socialism, and we at least think we know what that is. But I'm going to be talking about distributism, a system of micro-property, an economic system which encourages the widespread ownership of private productive property. And the word productive there is important because simply owning a home or having a bank own your home is not what distributism aims at. Distributism aims at the ownership of widespread productive property. This productive property, moreover, is to be well distributed so as to discourage extremes of wealth and poverty, not to make everybody have exactly the same amount of property or the same income. No, that's contrary to human nature. That's foolish. It's being a utopian project. But to avoid extremes of wealth and poverty, which both Leo XIII and Pius XI noted as one of the defects of the 19th century, that it did encourage those extremes of wealth and poverty and shocked the Christian conscience at the time. The ideal of distributism, an ideal that can probably never be completely realized, is for each owner to have his own property, farmland, workshop, or retail store, or some kind of service. Now, distributism is grounded in Catholic social teaching. For example, in Pope Leo XIII's call that, quote, "The law, therefore, should favor ownership, and its policy should be to induce as many people as possible to become owners." That's from Raymond of Arm. And in the context, of course, he's talking about ownership of productive property. And other later popes have repeated this teaching, Pius XI, John the 23rd, and Mater et Magistra. So distributists, therefore, we seek to minimize the employer-employee relationship by making as many people as possible owners of their own property. Although the wage relationship, as Pius XI explained in Quadragesimo Anno, is not unjust in itself, provided we are speaking of a living wage, distributists believe that when the employer-employer dichotomy becomes the ordinary way that a society is organized, this is dangerous and unwise. Why is this? And this is really a key point in justification for distributism. To answer this question, we must look for a minute at the purpose of economic activity. Why did God create man in such a way that we have both the capacity and the need to use external goods? What is the purpose of our production of goods and services? A Christian, and indeed any thoughtful person, will realize that we need external goods not as ends in themselves, but to sustain a life that is truly human, a life in which more important matters such as our families and friends, artistic and intellectual activity, and our relationship with Almighty God can flourish. Material goods, of course, are not evil, but in general, they are subordinate to more important values, and they must be judged in whether and how well they serve these values. For example, we wear shoes to protect our feet. That is their purpose. I might well need several pairs of shoes, but it is hard to see how anyone would need dozens of pairs of shoes. Similarly with dozens of cars or dozens of houses. In fact, our relationship with material goods is or should be limited by their relationship to fulfilling human needs. As St. Thomas Aquinas wrote, and I quote, "The appetite of natural riches is not infinite, because according to a set measure they satisfy nature." You can only eat so much food a day, and if you try to hoard too much food, it's liable to spoil. But, St. Thomas goes on, "The appetite of artificial riches is infinite, because it serves inordinate concupiscence." Very few people would collect 100 pairs of shoes, but people do tend to collect much more artificial wealth than they have any possible need for, and in so doing, they serve inordinate concupiscence. Now, if what I have said about material goods is true, then the production of goods and services ought to be oriented toward human use and human need. Any society which understands that material things are subordinate to human life in its fullness and are meant to serve human needs will not produce simply for the sake of piling up goods. Still less will engage in financial transactions which have little or no relationship to production or to the fulfilling of genuine human needs. But when the employer-employee distinction becomes widespread and characteristic of an economy, and especially when it has assumed the form of the business corporation, there will exist a class of people one step removed from the production of real goods. That is, for the most part, owners and managers of capital who employ others to work are no longer directly focused on the production of goods to serve human needs, but gradually become preoccupied with what St. Thomas called artificial riches, either by concentrating their efforts on merely sales or, worse still, on manipulating financial instruments for their gain. So in time, the managers of corporations tend to become more interested in mergers, buyouts, providing themselves generous pensions and salaries, rather than in the actual product their company produces, because they have become to some degree separated from that product. If they are likely to make more money more quickly with a merger or acquisition than with the steady production and sale of useful goods or services, they will often opt for the former. And with mergers and acquisitions, there frequently results less actual economic activity, less production of real goods and services, since the new company must often fire some of its workers in order to service the new debt it has taken on. Stockholders, meanwhile, although legally the owners of a company, usually have little interest in what the company actually manufactures so long as their dividend checks keep coming or the stock price is rising. Owners of mutual funds do not even own part of a company, but a form of artificial riches twice removed from real goods, traded on a market in which ownership of the actual company can change hands by the hour or the minute. And this is a quotation by one of the early distributists, Hilaire Belloc, summing up this process. I think it's a very important quotation. He says, "But wealth obtained indirectly as profit out of other men's work or by process of exchange becomes a thing abstracted from the process of production. As the interest of a man in things diminishes, his interest in abstract wealth, money, increases. The man who makes a table or grows a crop makes the success of the crop or the table a test of excellence. The intermediary who buys and sells the crop or the table is not concerned with the goodness of table or crop, but with the profit he makes between their purchase and sale. In a productive society, the superiority of the things produced is the measure of success. In a commercial society, the amount of wealth accumulated by the dealer is a measure of success," unquote. That's from his work, an essay on the nature of contemporary England. Distributism, therefore, seeks to maintain a healthy relationship between ownership and production by maintaining and encouraging small businesses, small workshops, small farms, in which the owner would always be personally involved in the actual production of the product or service. He would see himself primarily as a craftsman or a farmer or as some kind of service provider, rather than as someone who could indifferently make and sell books or shoes or computers, depending on where the greatest profit could be made at the moment. Now, when distributism is presented this way, people will immediately say, well, this sounds like you want to go back to the Middle Ages or something, or what about all the realities of our economy and our society, which would make this difficult? And of course, distributists are aware of this, and one of the questions that comes up immediately is, what about the entities that, because of the technology involved, must always be large scale? How could you break down Ford Motor Company, for example, into 10,000 micro companies? Well, this objection is hardly new, and in fact, Belloc and Chesterton addressed it in the early part of the 20th century. And the distributive solution is quite simple. Again, as much as possible, because distributism does not aim at 100% of its ideal ever being realized, but as much as possible, in any entity that necessarily is large because of the technology involved, the workers themselves should be the owners of the firm. And with regard to worker ownership, more than one model, of course, is possible. As John Paul II wrote in Laborem Exercens, proposals for joint ownership of the means of work, sharing by the workers in the management and or profits of business, so-called shareholding by labor, unquote, are all possible models for worker ownership. And if you look at the actual economy, you can see that even companies like Ford Motor Company years ago began outsourcing parts of their production because they realized that it was inefficient for the large central company to produce everything. And this, if we thought creatively enough, this could be done in a much larger scale than we're doing now.